My name is Jennifer Adler. I'm 45 years old. For 22 of those years, I served in the United States Army. I led logistics operations in Kandahar, Baghdad, and Djibouti. I held the rank of lieutenant colonel when I retired. But none of that mattered in court. I sat alone at the defendant's table. My brother Ethan and his wife Lena sat across from me. He wore a navy suit and a false look of concern. She clutched a tissue in one hand and avoided eye contact with me entirely. They were asking the court to declare me legally insane. Their petition claimed I suffered from severe post-combat psychosis, financial delusions, and was a threat to myself and others. They submitted a psychiatric report signed by someone I'd never met. They included clipped audio files, doctored fragmented things that painted me as erratic and unstable. A video was played in the courtroom, me pacing at a cemetery. What they didn't say was I had been burying a soldier under my command that day. Jennifer used to be strong, Ethan told the court, voice trembling. But now, she talks to herself. Withdraws. She's no longer the person we knew. I just want to protect my little sister. Lena dabbed her eyes, then handed over another folder. Bank records, real estate transfers, and the final blow, a bill of sale for my house. Signed, sealed, processed. Gone. I looked around the courtroom. Half the people there were strangers. The other half were silent. Not one face looked at me with kindness. Not one friend. Not one former colleague. I had no allies. In that moment, I realized something: they weren't trying to protect me. They were trying to erase me. They froze my bank accounts. They sold my house. They told a judge I was dangerous, unstable, mentally broken. After 22 years of decorated service, my own family said I was a danger to myself. And everyone listened. The judge leaned forward. "Miss Adler," he said, voice low and dry. "Do you have any response before I issue my preliminary ruling?" I didn't speak. Instead, I opened my briefcase and slid a sealed envelope across the table. That was the moment everything changed. The judge raised one eyebrow and took the envelope. He sliced the seal and flipped open the documents. At first, his expression was blank. Then his eyes narrowed. His lips parted, but he didn't speak. He read page after page. Then he looked up. "Close the doors," he said, voice steady but cold. There was a beat of confusion. The bailiff looked stunned. The clerk hesitated. Then, like clockwork, the double courtroom doors swung shut. Silence fell. And that was when I heard it: 12 synchronized steps, heavy boots striking polished floor. 12 Marines entered the courtroom. Their uniforms were sharp, their expressions neutral, their movements exact. They formed 2 lines behind me, then stepped aside as their commanding officer walked forward. Captain McKinley. He approached the judge, first saluted, then turned to me. "Lieutenant Colonel Adler," he said. "We are under direct orders from Central Command." He looked at Ethan. "Ethan Adler," he continued. "You are under arrest for wire fraud, impersonating a federal officer, tampering with military psychiatric records, and unauthorized sale of protected property." The courtroom gasped. I heard Lena inhale sharply. Ethan blinked like he'd been struck. "This is absurd," Ethan stammered. "She's lying. She's crazy. She forged everything." Quiet. The judge said firmly. "Captain, proceed." One Marine stepped forward. His cuffs clicked open. Ethan instinctively backed into Lena. She clutched his sleeve. "You can't be serious," Lena whispered. Another Marine held up a separate folder. "This," McKinley said, "includes digital logs from a classified Army server, accessed using credentials stolen from Lieutenant Colonel Adler while she was deployed. The logs match your IP address and timestamp, Mr. Adler." Ethan didn't speak. He didn't blink. His jaw dropped. His face turned pale. His knees buckled slightly. The Marine cuffed him calmly, efficiently, professionally. He didn't resist. Couldn't. He was too stunned. The room went dead silent. I didn't stand. I didn't gloat. I didn't look at Ethan or Lena. I simply placed my hands on my lap and let the truth sit in the space between us. For 22 years, I served quietly, loyally, with dignity. And when my family tried to destroy me, I didn't scream. I didn't beg. I handed the judge one paper, and 12 Marines entered and saluted me. That was enough. That was justice. My name is Jennifer Adler. I served 22 years in the United States Marine Corps, reaching the rank of lieutenant colonel. I specialized in logistical communications, ensuring that during 3 deployments to Afghanistan, Not a single supply route failed. Precision was my life. I trusted nothing but coordinates, code words, and encrypted protocols. Emotions had no place in my work. But there was one channel I always hoped would remain open: family. After our parents died in a car crash while I was deployed, I reached out to my brother Ethan, hoping grief would draw us closer. I wrote him long emails from my quarters. Some typed between midnight shifts, others scribbled after missions. I told him about the desert stars, the sound of silence after an extraction, the ache of losing our parents and not being able to come home for the funeral. But it was Lena, his wife, who responded every time. "Ethan's swamped with work," she said. "He's grieving in his own way. Don't take it personally." I didn't, not at first. But months passed, then years. The emails stopped coming. I would send updates, holidays, promotions, even just to say I was alive. No reply, no calls. My military inbox filled with silence. I convinced myself Ethan was simply trying to cope. I thought, maybe it hurts him too much to talk to me, or worse, maybe he blames me for not coming home. But deep down, I knew something didn't add up. I just didn't have time to dig. My duty came first, until the day it didn't. In early 2020, I was honorably discharged due to health complications. The injuries were internal nerve damage, inflammation, a shrapnel remnant near my spine. I was done marching. The Corps thanked me, but I wasn't ready to return to civilian life. Still, I packed my duffel, boarded a flight, and returned to my hometown, hoping that after all the years the familiar porch of my parents' old house would offer some comfort. But when I arrived, the house wasn't there. The building was still standing, yes, but the windows were different, the garden gone, and a family I'd never met waved at me from the lawn. I checked the address again. It was correct. A sign on the mailbox read, "Private property. No trespassing." I felt like I'd landed in someone else's life. I went to the records office. The house had been sold a year ago. The deed bore my signature, but I never signed it. I confronted Ethan. He showed up with a strained smile. "Jen," he said, too casual. "You don't remember. You signed the transfer when you were recovering at the rehab center. You said you didn't want the burden." His voice was calm. Too calm, but his eyes, they blinked just a fraction too long. The way he used to when he lied to our parents about stealing $20 from Dad's wallet. Only this time, it wasn't $20. It was my entire home. A week later, Lena dropped by my apartment. She brought homemade lemon bars. We hadn't spoken face to face in years. "You've been through a lot," she said, gently, sitting on the edge of my couch. "Ethan's really worried. You're not the same since the discharge. Have you thought about seeing someone, a psychiatrist?" I was cautious, but exhausted. I agreed to one session. We met at a local cafe, not a clinic, no receptionist. Just a man in his late 50s sipping chamomile tea and asking gentle questions. I answered a few, talked about the war, the silence, the missing house. But I never said I was paranoid. I never claimed Ethan was dangerous. I never authorized recording. Yet 3 weeks later, in the initial petition to strip me of civil competency there, it was. She suffers from post-combat paranoia, depression, and delusional thinking. She believes her brother is watching her. She fears he is stealing her assets. I was stunned. The psychiatric report included transcripts, word-for-word lines I never remembered saying. And the closing line read, "In my professional opinion, Jennifer Adler poses a danger to herself and others. Institutionalization may be required." I felt cold, not from fear, but from the precision of it all. They hadn't just cut me out of the family. They'd prepared a surgical extraction of my identity. My name showed up in a place I never expected, on a classified internal list from the Defense Intelligence Agency. It was an old friend, Marquez, who called. "Jenny, this might sound strange, but your name was flagged in a routine cross-check. Something about Thistle Blue." I froze. Thistle Blue was a humanitarian logistics operation I oversaw during my third deployment in Kandahar 2017. The mission was meant to supply forward units with medical aid, gauze, IVs, portable defibrillators. But I had ordered a full suspension after our weekly reports showed discrepancies in inventory. Boxes marked for combat zones were either missing or filled with expired goods. I thought I had buried that decision. And yet now, years later, here it was, my name tethered to something still under review. I asked Marquez for a copy of the materials. What he sent me shattered me more than I was ready for, because next to my name in the vendor manifest of that same operation was another name, Ethan Adler, my brother. He was listed as an independent logistics subcontractor approved during the tail end of 2016, weeks before I was transferred to Kandahar. I'd had no idea he was even in country. He had never told me. The coincidence was too loud to ignore. Suddenly, flashbacks from the camp hit me. A tall man ducking into the supply tent in the middle of a sandstorm. I had thought I recognized the gait, thought maybe I was hallucinating from dehydration or stress. But now with his name right there in an encrypted database, it wasn't a hallucination at all. He was there. He had always been there. But why I dug through my old deployment logs like a woman possessed. Every scribbled note, every backup USB tucked into labeled envelopes, my own form of time capsules. I'd always kept copies, even when the Army told me I didn't need to. Old habits die hard. And there it was. One audit report half complete and never submitted. I remembered working on it late at night, the desert wind howling against the tent fabric. The document was flagged as not actionable by my superior, Colonel Davies. He told me the shortage was within acceptable margin and to focus on morale, not boxes. I'd let it go. At the time, I believed him. The document detailed missing pallets, 23 to be exact, containing trauma kits and water filtration systems. The chain of custody records had inconsistencies. Codes were altered, routes changed. One particular signature caught my eye. Not Ethan's, but someone from his contracting company. Suddenly, I remembered something else. The day I walked past the supply yard and saw a man loading crates into a civilian truck. His face was turned away, but his stance, familiar. When I called out, he didn't turn around. That moment passed quickly. I never followed up. Now I knew why. Because if I had walked 10 more steps that day, I would have seen my brother stealing from the very mission I had sworn to protect. And I didn't. I didn't see it then. But I see it now. There are rules you live by as a soldier. You protect the innocent, you serve the truth. But what happens when the enemy shares your blood? For days I sat with it, knowing that if I moved forward with this, I wasn't just exposing fraud. I was destroying the last remaining piece of my family. Ethan was all I had left. Lena never called. There were no cousins, no aunts, just us siblings from a line of silence holding together like a fragile bridge. But I also remembered Specialist Dante Ruiz. He was 22, shot through the abdomen, bleeding out fast. We called for supplies, but the trauma kits never arrived. We improvised with belts and spare cloth. He died in my arms whispering, "Tell my mom I tried. Tell my mom I tried." Those words haunted me more than Ethan's betrayal. So I made a choice. I printed out my findings. I circled every line Ethan's company had touched. I took photos of the altered manifests and uploaded copies to 3 encrypted drives. I mailed one to Marquez, one to my old commanding officer now retired, and one I kept in a sealed envelope under my pillow. On that envelope, I wrote only one sentence. For the ones who never made it home, for every Ruiz, for every silent casualty, for every person who trusted me to fight for them not just in combat, but in truth. I picked up a marker and walked to the whiteboard, and I wrote in thick black strokes, Ethan Adler, accountability. For the first time in 22 years of service, my hand shook. But I didn't stop writing. The thing about fraud is it leaves a trail. Always. Even when you try to hide it behind 10 layers of bureaucracy, dummy firms, and shredded documents, numbers don't lie. People do. I started digging into subcontractor contracts, tied to Thistle Blue. It took weeks, quiet nights, burner emails, VPNs, dead ends. But once I found the first inconsistency, it all unraveled. Ethan's name never appeared directly again. But 3 companies, Modulus Prime Breckenridge Solutions and Halvertech, were tied to the same billing address in Cheyenne, Wyoming. A vacant lot. That was the first clue. The second was worse. Several invoices from these shell companies bore my name and signature on procurement authorizations I had supposedly approved. But I knew those documents were fake. Not just because I had never signed them, but because they were printed using a specific military dot matrix format that had been discontinued 5 years ago. I remembered that printer. We called it the dinosaur. Loud, slow, and impossible to mistake. I had personally submitted it for disposal. Someone had resurrected it. I traced the metadata on one invoice. The embedded file name was OP Order Adler 87 Draft, dated 3 days after I had already returned stateside. They were sloppy, confident I would never look back. I compiled everything cross-referenced ENs, linked dummy corporations, matched IP addresses used for invoice submissions. Every single arrow pointed to Ethan, or at least to someone using my identity to cover his tracks. This wasn't just about stolen supplies anymore. It was identity theft, misuse of military credentials, and falsification of federal documents. I needed someone I could trust, someone not too high up that they'd be compromised, and not too far removed to dismiss me as a paranoid ex-officer. So I called Lieutenant Colonel Elise Navarro. We had served together during my first tour. She now worked in a quiet desk position at the Defense Logistics Agency. I sent her the file. 1 hour later, she called back. "Jenny, I forwarded everything to the Pentagon. Stay off your phone, use secure lines only, and don't tell anyone where you are." Her voice was calm. Too calm. That was the moment I realized this thing was far from over. It had just begun. Lieutenant Colonel Navarro didn't just forward my evidence, she took it seriously. That meant more than I can explain. When you've spent years being silenced by people who claim to love you, having just one voice say, "I believe," you can shift your entire center of gravity. A few days later, she reached out again. "There's someone I want you to meet. Quiet guy. Doesn't make waves. But if your brother really did what you say, he's the one who can help." That was how I met Captain McKinley. We sat in the back of a restricted hangar at Pendleton, at a plastic table covered in flight maps and half-empty coffee cups. McKinley wore the uniform like it belonged to his skin. His posture, his focus, even the way he breathed it all said discipline. But his eyes were kind. He didn't rush me, didn't treat me like a broken vet or a fragile witness. He just listened. I laid out everything, the fake contracts, the printer model, the mismatched dates, the buried audit, the doctored psychiatric report. I even brought photos from Kandahar, pictures of Marines trying to seal bleeding wounds with plastic wrap, because we were out of gauze. He said nothing until I finished. Then he asked me only one question. "Ma'am, if it comes to it, are you ready for 12 Marines to walk into that courtroom with you?" I looked at him for a long moment. I thought of the kid whose femoral artery I held closed with my bare hands, while he begged for his mother. I thought of the senior corpsman who yelled into the radio for blood units that never came. And I thought of myself 22 years of service standing in front of a judge being called insane by my own brother. So I answered the only way I could. "I've been ready since the day I saw them burying bandages with their bare hands." He nodded once. The next morning, I received an encrypted file marked Operation Vantage Point, Preliminary Engagement Plan. 12 names were listed, and mine was one of them. It took me 6 nights to prepare the envelope, not because the evidence was hard to gather, I already had it, but because sealing it felt like closing the last door between Ethan and me. Whatever part of me still hoped he'd confess or come clean, this envelope killed it. Inside, I placed everything. First, the accounting breakdown, procurement invoices with forged initials, duplicate shipping manifests, and internal memos from Thistle showing how lost supplies were redirected. Then came the GPS data hard coordinates, showing unauthorized cargo movements that matched Ethan's travel records. Next, the video files, not from news reports or open channels, but direct pulls from military surveillance drones, frames of trucks rerouting under cover of night, pallets being unloaded where no delivery was scheduled. One video showed a contractor's badge swinging from someone's neck. The ID was blurry, but the posture, the gait. It was unmistakably Ethan. I saved the final piece for last. It was a signed directive, an official request from a high-ranking official in the Department of the Navy, authorizing an emergency investigation into fraudulent military procurement, tied to Operation Thistle. McKinley had helped me get it cleared through legal channels. It wasn't a warrant, but it was a hammer. I placed it all in a thick manila envelope, sealed it with reinforced tape, and signed across the flap. Then I took out a blue pen and wrote one sentence slowly in block letters, to be opened only if the defendant requests guardianship, based on claimed mental incompetence. That was the catch. If Ethan and Lena had simply tried to quietly settle or stall or misdirect, I wouldn't have used it. But if they tried to erase my autonomy, if they dared to say I wasn't fit to live freely, then the gloves were off. I placed the envelope in a lockbox with 2 keys. One I kept, the other I gave to Lieutenant Colonel Navarro. As she took it, she looked at me and said, "You understand what this will do to your brother?" I nodded. "No one gets to erase 22 years of service," I said. And I meant it. When I stepped back into the courtroom, everything felt colder. The walls, the air, even the way people looked at me. As if I were a ghost walking through her own trial. Lena sat tall with her arms folded. Ethan gave me that same rehearsed frown he'd been wearing since the hearing started, concerned paternal fake. The judge held the sealed envelope in his hand. "Ms. Adler, you previously submitted this to the court. Are you ready for it to be reviewed?" I nodded once. "Yes, Your Honor." He broke the seal slowly. For a few seconds, he just scanned the contents. Then his eyes paused, locked. I watched the shift happen, barely visible but there. A single tightening around his jawline, a subtle intake of breath. Then his voice firm, "Court security, lock the doors. Nobody enters, nobody exits." There was silence then, the shuffle of guards moving quickly to comply. 5 seconds later, the courtroom doors burst open and in walked 12 U.S. Marines in dress uniform. They moved in formation, straight-backed, no smiles, no uncertainty. Their boots struck the floor like punctuation marks. The lead officer, Captain McKinley, marched up to the judge, saluted, then turned to me. "Lieutenant Colonel Jennifer Adler, ma'am. We are present on orders from the Inspector General's office." He turned again, this time facing Ethan. "Ethan Adler," he said, "you are under investigation for federal crimes, including military fraud, falsifying government documents, identity theft, and compromising national security assets. You are advised to remain silent." Ethan shot up from his chair, eyes wide, sputtering. "She's lying, she's fabricating everything. My sister is mentally unstable, she's been hallucinating for years." His voice cracked under the weight of panic. Captain McKinley didn't blink. He raised a plastic evidence sleeve. Inside, a printed invoice bearing Ethan's forged signature and my military ID number, used without my consent on a government procurement form. The court clerk leaned forward. "Your Honor, that invoice was processed through a decommissioned military printer. The serial number matches one that was shut down in 2019. The judge stared at Ethan, then back at the Marines. "Proceed." 2 Marines stepped forward, flanking Ethan. He jerked his arms away, but there was no point. One of them reached down, calm and firm, and clicked a pair of handcuffs around his wrists. Lena gasped. The gallery remained frozen. I stood perfectly still, letting the silence fill the room like water in a sinking ship. I didn't smile. I didn't cry. I just breathed. 22 years of service, and this was the first moment anyone saw me not as a broken veteran, but as the soldier who came home. Captain McKinley didn't flinch. His voice cut through the courtroom like a razor cuff him. One simple command, and suddenly the courtroom wasn't a courtroom anymore. It was a field of consequences. 2 Marines stepped in. Their movements were precise, controlled, unwavering. Ethan didn't speak. Not at first. He just stood there, rooted in place, as if his legs had suddenly forgotten how to move. "No, no, you can't," Lena's voice cracked into a scream. She shot up, lunging toward Ethan like she could shield him from military justice. Another Marine stepped in, blocking her path gently but firmly, guiding her back down. "Ma'am, please remain seated." The words were calm. The force behind them was immovable. Captain McKinley held up a small sealed document, the printed military warrant bearing the signature of the Army Chief of Staff. By direct order of the Department of Defense, he said, his tone heavy with formality, "Ethan Adler is under arrest for the following charges: embezzlement of military funds, unauthorized access to secured communications, falsification of federal documents, identity theft of a commissioned officer, and obstruction of justice during an ongoing military investigation." Lena shook her head wildly. "She made this up. She's the one with delusions. You can't just arrest him. This isn't some show." The judge banged the gavel once, loud and final. "Order in the courtroom. Sit down, Mrs. Adler." And she did. Or rather, collapsed. Ethan's voice finally found its way back to his lips. "This is insane. You think I would—" He stopped mid-sentence as one of the Marines pulled his hands behind his back. The clink of the steel cuffs was crisp and loud. I hadn't moved. I hadn't said a word. My hands were still resting quietly on my lap. the same posture I'd held from the moment the envelope was opened. But the moment Ethan's skin touched the cold steel, something in me stirred. I turned my head slowly. For the first time that morning, I allowed myself to look him directly in the eyes. His face, once smug, always calculated, was now gray with disbelief. His jaw-clenched eyes darting between the judge, the Marines, and the floor, like he was still trying to solve a problem too late. Then softly but clearly, I spoke. "The last time you called me little sister, you were lying too." The words floated into the courtroom like smoke after gunfire. He froze. Even Lena, who'd been whispering something incoherent into her sleeve, stopped speaking. Ethan's mouth opened, then closed. There was no rebuttal, no spin, nothing left to distort. McKinley nodded to the Marines, "Escort the prisoner." As Ethan was led away, the sound of his footsteps echoed like fading thunder. No one else in the room made a sound. No one dared. I watched him go, not with vengeance in my heart, but with something else, something cleaner, harder, not victory, but clarity. He had stolen more than my house, my name, my voice. He had tried to erase me, and still I remained. I didn't need applause. I didn't need anyone to say they were sorry. I only needed one thing, that steel click, that quiet look in his eyes when he realized the war he started was over. And he had lost. The headlines hit the defense circuit before I could take my next breath. Former logistics officer arrested for defrauding U.S. military sister, a decorated Marine, uncovers decade-long scheme. Veteran faked sister's mental illness to steal property and hide war profiteering crimes. The story was everywhere. Emails, internal memos, encrypted threads on military forums, command briefings. It didn't take long before I started getting calls, not the warm congratulatory kind, but clipped messages from people I'd once shared war zones and sandstorms with. People who didn't know whether to call me brave or complicit. Why now? One email read, "No greeting, no signature, just that." Another, "If you knew, why didn't you speak up 5 years ago?" The worst one didn't ask anything. It was a forwarded link to an old group photo from Kandahar, me, Captain Luther, Sergeant Alvarez, and 3 others who didn't make it home. The caption read, "When did you stop caring?" I didn't respond to any of them. Because there are questions you don't answer with words, only with your life. The truth is, yes, I knew something was wrong. Not everything, not the full scope. But I had seen shadows, funds, misplaced inventory, shifted protocols ignored. I had felt that sense of wrongness humming like static behind every sealed crate and every misfiled report. But I didn't act. I told myself it was above my rank, that the system would self-correct, that Ethan couldn't possibly be capable of something so vast, so vile, that I was just tired or overthinking or projecting. But mostly, I was afraid. Not for myself. For what it would cost me to name the betrayal. Because when family is your last remaining thread, even a rotten thread feels better than nothing. And I clung to it until it snapped. Now the military command was in full damage control mode. Investigations were launched into procurement contracts stretching back a decade. DIA reopened files that had long gathered dust. Task forces were created. But the whispers kept coming. Some praised me, she brought justice. Some doubted, she waited until her name was at stake. Some just wanted distance. The same officers who once shook my hand now looked past me in hallways. A few tried to be kind, awkward, forced smiles over coffee machines. I didn't blame them. War teaches you how to shut doors silently. I wasn't angry at them. I understood. Because truth doesn't make people comfortable, it makes them accountable. And most people prefer comfort over accountability. So I kept moving. Kept reporting to the base I was cleared to visit. Kept following up with investigators. Kept updating the files I'd started building from my home office. Not for revenge. Not for validation, but because those Marines who died under my command deserved more than silence. Because my mother, who taught me the value of standing tall, even when standing hurts, deserved more than a daughter who turned her face away. And because Ethan, for all the lies he spun, for all the harm he cloaked in charm and paperwork, was wrong about one thing. I wasn't lost, I wasn't broken, and I wasn't finished. A month after the trial, a plain white envelope appeared in my mailbox. No return address. No stamps. Just my name written in Lena's unmistakable cursive, still so precise. so contained like everything else about her. I stood in the kitchen staring at it for minutes. I didn't know if I wanted to open it, but I did. Inside was a letter, handwritten, 3 pages long. The paper smelled faintly of chamomile, and something older like a drawer that hadn't been opened in years. Jennifer, it began. No salutation, no warmth. I won't waste your time trying to justify anything. I just want you to know I didn't know Ethan had gone that far. I really didn't. I thought we were trying to protect you from yourself. She didn't specify what she meant by that. Maybe she meant my nightmares. Maybe she meant the months after I came home when I barely spoke, barely slept, and woke up with the taste of sand and diesel in my mouth. Maybe she meant the time I cried in her laundry room for no reason while folding socks. Or maybe she meant none of those things. Maybe she was just grasping for something that would make her part in all of this feel less cruel. I knew about the doctor, the letter continued. I thought it was harmless, just someone to talk to. Ethan told me it was for your benefit. I believed him. That's on me. There was no apology, not directly, not even indirectly. Only that same detached rationality she always wore, like perfume, subtle, ever-present, hard to scrub off. The last page held a folded document, a legal deed. It was the property transfer my parents' home, now back in my name. The original one, the one I never signed away. It had been quietly refiled through a friend of hers in real estate law. No court order, no public statement, just a reversal. As if returning what had been stolen could undo what had been shattered. Beneath the deed, a single sentence sat by itself. I understand I'm no longer your family. That was it. No signature, no love, Lena. No plea for forgiveness or invitation for reconciliation. Just a line that felt like the final breath of a burned bridge. I folded the letter back into its envelope and set it on the counter. I didn't cry. There's a grief that sits so deep inside you it doesn't need tears. It just settles, like dust over things that once mattered. Lena had been my sister-in-law longer than most people stay married. She was at my graduation from OCS. She drove me to the airport for my first deployment. She stood beside me at both my parents' funerals. She knew my favorite tea, my fear of flying the name of every dog I'd ever wanted to adopt. But she also watched me unravel, and instead of reaching out, she documented the fall. She helped my brother fake my diagnosis. She helped him erase me. So no, she wasn't my family anymore. But I didn't hate her. Hatred requires too much space, too much energy. And I was finally learning how to live in peace, with the truth, with my name, with my home returned not just in ink, but in ownership of my story. I had never been back to Washington wearing civilian shoes. But that morning, as I walked into the hall of the Pentagon, I wasn't a soldier returning from the field. I was a witness to something deeper, a reckoning perhaps, or a restoration. The letter had arrived 2 weeks earlier, signed by the Assistant Secretary of Defense. A formal invitation, an acknowledgement, the Medal of Honor. It wasn't for combat. It wasn't for something that would be written into history books or shouted by journalists. The citation read, "For preserving the integrity of the United States Armed Forces and demonstrating extraordinary courage in the face of internal betrayal." I wore a dark navy suit. No medals, no uniform. The press didn't know the full story. They had bits and pieces. Former Marine exposes logistics scandal, sister of indicted contractor speaks out. But most of them still didn't know about the envelope, or the Marines, or the courtroom. Good. It wasn't their story to own. The rotunda was quiet except for the clicking of polished heels and the low murmurs of staffers taking their places. I stood off stage behind the curtain alone until they arrived. All 12 of them, the Marines from the courtroom. They wore dress blues this time, lined up with surgical precision, their eyes forward, postures unyielding. Captain McKinley gave me a small nod. No words, none were needed. When my name was called, I stepped out. The room stood. But it wasn't the applause I noticed, it was the way the air shifted the moment I reached the podium. Behind me, the 12 Marines took their positions in 2 rows. And then in a single motion, they raised their hands and saluted. 12 salutes. 12 men who had dug through classified reports, tracked falsified shipments, crossed jurisdictional boundaries to protect something they still believed in. I steadied myself, fingers brushing the side of the wooden podium. I could have given a speech. I could have thanked mentors, named units, remembered fallen comrades. I could have talked about what it feels like to have your sanity questioned by the only family you have left. But I didn't. Instead, I looked out over the sea of uniforms, cameras, and silent onlookers and said just one thing. Justice is not revenge, it is the restoration of truth. Then I stepped back. There was silence. And then applause, not the loud political kind, but the kind that builds from breath. The kind that feels like a collective exhale after a long silence. I stood there for a moment longer, then turned and walked off stage. The Marines followed. One of them held the door. The land looked smaller than I remembered. The old oak tree was still there, its limbs heavier, lower, like time had finally made it kneel. I stepped out of the truck and walked to the edge of the property boots, pressing into the same earth my father once tilled with his bare hands. For the first time in years, it felt like the ground wasn't pushing me away. With the settlement from the civil case enough to cover what Ethan stole, and more, I didn't buy a new life. I rebuilt the old one. I bought back the land. It hadn't been easy. The new owner had plans for a luxury lodge. But when he found out what happened, what had been done to me, and what I intended to build, he sold it without a fight. I think he saw something in my eyes. Maybe regret for something he couldn't name. Maybe a quiet promise that I would make this place matter. The first building that went up wasn't fancy. A single-story cottage with steel framing and wide doors. No locks, no cameras. Just a fireproof safe for confidential notes, and a kettle that never ran dry. I called it the Listening Post, a counseling and recovery center for veterans run by veterans. No bureaucracy, no ranking, no pressure to speak unless you wanted to. I had walked in and out of too many institutions where silence was seen as a warning sign. Here it was seen as strength. Every Thursday we hosted open hours for drop-ins, people just passing through needing a couch, a story, or a moment of eye contact without judgment. Some left after 5 minutes. Some stayed until sunrise. One guy cried for 3 straight hours without saying a word. I gave him a glass of water and sat on the floor next to him. That was all he needed. Eventually, I had the front gate restored. The hinges creaked like they remembered everything. And above the entrance, I placed a wooden sign, weathered, sanded, and re-stained by hand. It had once hung over my father's workshop, carved by him with a penknife during a long winter. Nothing wrong with silence. It's what you do after that defines you. Some people ask why I didn't name the center after myself. I always smile and say the same thing. It's not about me, it's about what comes next. One afternoon, I watched 2 Marines walk up the gravel path. They didn't recognize me. They were just looking for a place to breathe. I opened the door and let them in. Then I put on the kettle. The red light blinked on. A soft hum filled the sound booth. Just me, the mic, and the quiet pulse of recording equipment. I'd rehearsed this 100 times in my head, but now that it was real, my hands trembled just enough to feel it. I leaned forward, cleared my throat once, and pressed the button. My name is Jennifer Adler. I served 22 years in the United States Armed Forces. I paused. It wasn't fear. It was the weight of finally being allowed to speak without being interrupted, doubted, or redirected. I've been called a lot of things: a threat, unstable, unfit, even insane. I looked through the glass where no one sat. I'd chosen the late shift on purpose. No producers, no guests, no distractions. Just me. But I'm still here, and I'm grateful for that. There was a long silence. I let it settle, not awkward, not heavy, just real. If you're listening to this, chances are you've worn the uniform or loved someone who has. You've sat in rooms where you didn't speak, not because you had nothing to say, but because the words you needed didn't seem safe to say out loud. I looked down at the script I wrote by hand, then pushed it aside. I used to think silence was weakness, that if I didn't fight every attack I was letting people win. But then I learned something: silence can also be strategy. Sometimes silence is survival. My voice cracked on that last word. I didn't edit it out. I want you to know, whoever you are, wherever you're listening from, if you've been called crazy or difficult or dangerous just for remembering things others want to forget, I see you. I believe you. I reached into my jacket pocket and touched the old military tag I'd kept since deployment. It was scratched, faded, nearly unreadable, but it was mine. Years ago, I tried to report something. It disappeared. So did I, in a way. My family said I imagined it, that I was spiraling. They even hired a doctor to write a report saying I'd lost my mind. I took a breath. The air tasted like metal. But eventually, truth outlives lies. It might not be loud. It might not come with applause, but it endures. I stood up, turned toward the soundproof glass, and looked into my own reflection. For anyone out there who feels erased or replaced or rewritten, don't rush to prove yourself to people committed to misunderstanding you. I smiled, not out of joy but of arrival. You don't owe them your sanity. You owe yourself peace. I looked down at my notes. The last sentence was underlined twice. If you're still here listening, breathing, choosing to keep going, I want you to remember this silence is not surrender. Sometimes it's just how we outlast them. I reached over, hit the stop button, and watched the light turn off. The booth fell into silence again. But this time it felt different. Not empty, just complete. The broadcast ended with a soft click. Just static now. Somewhere in Texas, a former medic turned off his garage radio and sat quietly in the dark, his calloused hands folded over his chest. The words I'd just spoken echoed in the oil-stained silence around him. He reached for a tin box, pulled out a ribbon he hadn't looked at in over a decade, and placed it on the table. His wife didn't know he still had it. In Vermont, a woman with a cane leaned on the kitchen counter. She hadn't worn her uniform since the injury that sent her home. She listened to the last line. Silence is not surrender, and closed her eyes. She reached up to touch the dog tags still hanging behind the pantry door, then let out a long, shivering breath. In an apartment in Chicago, a young veteran stared at the laptop screen. Tears fell silently onto the keyboard. No sobbing, just release. They'd told him it was all in his head, that he was fine, that what happened didn't happen. But tonight, for the first time, he didn't feel like the only one carrying ghosts. All across the country, the broadcast traveled radio signals and online clips passed between coffee shops, waiting room support groups. Someone burned it to a CD and mailed it to their brother in a correctional facility. Someone else posted the quote on a bulletin board outside a community center for displaced veterans. And somewhere deep inside a VA hospital in Arizona, a nurse's aide walked into a long-term care ward and found a silver-haired man sitting up in bed, tears in his eyes. He held a tiny bronze pin in his hand. She said what I always wanted someone to say, he whispered. I didn't know any of these people. But somehow we were linked. That was the point. By the time morning came, messages had flooded the station inbox. Thank you. I thought I was alone. I needed that. There were no hashtags, no trends, just voices, soft, raw, and finally unafraid. Back in my small cabin, I sat near the window with a cup of tea between my hands. Steam curled slowly into the air. It was early, the world still quiet. I hadn't smiled in 5 years, not a real one. But as I watched the light stretch across the floorboards, something inside me let go. My lips lifted, not for the cameras, not for defense, just because. For years I had been reduced to whispers behind closed doors, folders marked confidential, files sealed, discarded, denied. But now my story was out there, stitched into the voices of others who'd also been told to sit down, be quiet, and let it go. We didn't. On the screen that played my final words, a sentence faded into view. To all who were silenced, we hear you now. I set down my cup, and I whispered back, thank you. Before I sign off, I want to thank you for being here. You didn't have to click on this story, but you did. And that means you stayed through the quiet moments, the hard truths, and the silence I once believed would never be broken. So tell me, where are you watching from? Is it a quiet morning with your hands wrapped around a warm cup of coffee? Or a late night when the world feels too loud and stories like this help you breathe again? Wherever you are, I want you to know I see you. Not literally, no, but in the way only someone who's walked through fire without screaming can recognize another soul carrying ashes in their pockets. And if anything I said today made you pause, made you feel even a little less alone, consider staying with us. Subscribe, not just for stories, but for reminders that silence isn't shame, that healing isn't weakness, that sometimes justice walks in quietly in uniform and stands beside you when no one else will. Thank you for giving me your time. Thank you for letting me speak finally. I hope you carry this story with you, not because it was mine, but because maybe one day someone else will need to hear it from you. Until then, hold fast, be kind to your past self, and remember, sometimes the miracle doesn't knock on your door. It waits quietly until you're strong enough to answer. See you in the next story.